Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Health Tech Crew podcast. I'm your host, Igor Gorlatov, and today we have the privilege of hosting a titan in the field of healthcare business development, Matthew Hanis. Matthew's superpower lies in identifying customer needs and substantiating the business case. He's a seasoned individual contributor and team leader with a deep understanding and vast experience in the business of healthcare. His expertise spans across various areas such as working with health systems, medical groups, and government agencies, to creating and marketing new products, to deploying emerging technologies like AI and workflow automation. Matthew showcased his commercial acumen as the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Sales at MedChat, where he impressively grew revenue by staggering 225% and closed contracts with 40 top-tier accounts, including the likes of Banner Health, Boston Scientific, and Vanderbilt Health. Alongside his notable corporate accomplishments, Matthew has also been the driving force behind the Business of Healthcare, an online interview series where he engages with senior leaders making measurable contributions to healthcare. This platform allowed him to sharpen his skills as a public speaker and thought leader. So prepare yourself for a journey to the heart of healthcare business, the novel solutions revolutionizing the industry, and exploration of what it takes to flourish in the dynamic, rapidly evolving space. Without further ado, let's extend a warm Health Tech Crew welcome to Matthew Hanis. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Igor. Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you for joining us on the Health Tech Crew podcast.
It's my pleasure.
So, you've been part of the health tech industry for a while. You worked in different roles. Could you tell us how you ventured into healthcare and what has your career been since then?
Yeah. I've been in health tech since the mid-90s. And my entry into the industry was with a company called Apache Medical Systems. Apache really would meet the definition of artificial intelligence. It was a algorithm designed to predict the outcome of critical care patients while they're in the ICU. And so I had talked my way into a job with this company, which was diving into the deep end, right? I didn't even know enough about healthcare to realize that I had jumped into one of the most complex areas. But it was, fascinating to me intellectually, and I was a gung-ho sales guy ready to sell the daylights out of it. And there was a very stunning moment for me, and it was a moment that really set the direction of my career. And that was I had developed a deal to the point where we were ready to close, and I was on site at a hospital. And the way we would sell is we would go into an ICU and we would collect data, and then we would use that data to prove what would be the return on investment for deploying the software. Well, while I was there was this 16-year-old girl or woman who had had a liver transplant, and she had bounced back to the ICU after having gone home, and that's always a bad sign. And the Apache algorithms were pretty accurate to the point where it was clear that she was going to die.
Wow.
And I had this very guttural moment where, I was there anxiously preparing to sell a product and make some money and make some commission and make a name for myself. And suddenly the cold, hard reality of what healthcare is really about stood in front of me. And that was the moment where I kind of realized, hey, I want to do this, and I want to do it in a for-profit setting, but I want to do it in a way that supports mission, that generates a result that we can all be proud of. So that was my entry into healthcare.
Do I understand correctly that your focus has always been around sales, correct?
Yeah, I've always been on the commercial side of the business. That's fundamentally my skill set. Is I'm good at figuring out what the market needs and helping a company guide its product direction as well as its sales and marketing direction to capture that need.
And this is like something that I'm learning right now and trying to figure it out for Kepler as well as a young startup company, how to be great at sales, how to be great at sales when you don't have a big brand behind you.
Yep.
So from your experience, what
is the one or maybe a couple of critical factors that are essential for a person who is building a career in sales to have or to develop?
It's all about consultative. If you have to put yourself in the shoes of the buyer and immerse yourself in the problem that they're trying to solve and what it is that your capabilities can do to help them solve that problem. The worst thing that a salesperson can do is spend time talking about their product and capabilities until they thoroughly understand what it is that buyer needs. And I always, for all the salespeople that have worked for me, if any of them happen to see this, they'll remember this, which is don't start selling until you've convinced yourself that what you sell is valuable to this customer. The sooner you can figure out that the customer can't benefit from it, get out of that room for your benefit and for theirs.
But I think the challenge is often to get people to open up, especially busy people in the healthcare space, so that they are able to give you enough insight into their world so that you can start this consultative process. Are there any hints on that front?
Sure. What you're taking a step back and saying, okay, I'm not in the conversation yet.
Exactly.
I got a lead gen problem. I need to get the conversation going.
Maybe I have a conversation, but it's not the right kind of conversation.
I mean, the right conversation is a conversation where you're spending a lot of time asking questions. And if you have enough expertise in the space that you're selling in, your questions are going to lead that customer to recognize that you have value to offer. The worst salespeople are those who spend a lot of time talking about the functionality of their product or why their product is so good or what their product does. The best people are those who already know all that. They have to know that. But they're so expert in the problem that they solve that the conversation that they're having with the customer is about the problem the customer's trying to solve. And that's what I find to be the most engaging. That's what customers want to talk about. They want to express their problem and they want to understand how you can solve their problem.
I like that. That resonates with me. And I think I can apply that advice for sure. So beyond this entry into health care, you had quite a career. You had a number of organizations that you worked for. Could you talk a little bit about some highs and lows of being a sales executive in health tech?
Yeah. So Apache, we grew it, and ultimately it was sold to Cerner. And when we sold that, it became a part of the Cerner platform, still a part of the platform today. And at that point, I transitioned over to Thomson Reuters, which was a big monster company. But it wasn't called Thomson Reuters at the time. It was a smaller entity called Solution that ultimately was acquired by Thomson. So I spent about 8 years there. And it was a dysfunctional organization. Most organizations are dysfunctional. It was dysfunctional in the sense that the sales organization was highly motivated to sell and close, which a sales organization should. But the salespeople generally were not knowledgeable about the product or the space. And you could sort of see in the sales organization, there were a few salespeople that really, really understood the capabilities and they were successful. And then there were, and the space. And then there were a lot of salespeople who have recently been brought in that really didn't understand the space, didn't understand the product, didn't understand why people bought the product. And that was a bit catastrophic. There was a lot of a churn of those salespeople. I always advise organizations, you can certainly add more salespeople in the short term. You might get more deals, but for the deals that have staying power, for the deals that generate good revenue and profit to the organization, a very small number of your salespeople are probably generating those deals. Less is more in a mature sales organization. So we got there because you asked me about the highs and lows, and
yes,
and it was turbulent. That was a turbulent place to work, and I wasn't the best at managing the dysfunction of that organization. I was kind of like you. I was a little too blunt.
Okay.
And I wasn't mature enough to sort of say, hey, I see some problems, but I'm not going to talk about those problems. And if I could go back to myself at that age, the one word that I would give myself would be shut up. But it was an 8-year run, and I got to go through several acquisitions, was involved in some of those transactions, and it taught me a lot about the data that makes up the backbone of our healthcare system. And it taught me a lot about business and profitability and EBITDA and all those really important things that get into managing a business.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing. And yes, I'm in the US. I'm learning how to be quiet and how to shut up in certain situations, and it's valuable.
Never with me, Igor. Never shut up when you and I are talking.
I think that makes a lot of sense because as someone who's inexperienced, you think you're the only one seeing the challenge, and you don't understand the underlying currents. You don't understand the political environment that leads to this challenge.
Yeah.
And understanding that, and also building a coalition for change versus trying to be the only voice that speaks up. Those are my lessons so far.
Yeah. Look, we all have to earn the right, and sometimes we're overambitious in the value of our own opinion.
That's true. That's very true. You mentioned data, so I have a question about data and your time at Thomson Reuters.
Yeah.
Have you seen health tech innovations combine healthcare data to drive population health propositions, and how do those innovations get implemented?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting time in our healthcare system, because if you think about it, what we understand of our healthcare system, for the most part, is the byproduct of billing data, right? So health systems, what's the technology that runs a health system? Well, it's an electronic health record. What's an EHR? It's a billing system. And what that means is that we're capturing information about the delivery of healthcare from the vantage point of how we charge for healthcare. So if I want to understand the US healthcare system, when I look at the data viewing the system en masse, most of that data is going to come from the billing process, or on the payer side, the payment process. The problem with that is it doesn't really give you a very good view into how good the care is. It doesn't give you a very good view about the longitudinal experience of the patient. Now, that's a big chunk of the data that tells us about our system. We also have a second chunk of data. That second chunk of data is clinical data. And that data could be in the form of clinical trials. It can be in the form from academic research, surveys, and so forth. It can also be data that does come from the EHR, but it's pulling the more clinical data out of the EHR and trying to do things with it. In the nomenclature, that's real world evidence or real world data. And so what's happening, and really this started with the HITECH Act and then subsequently with HIPAA, is we had a lot of federal funding that came in that nurtured the presence of clinical data and the availability of clinical data, particularly clinical data that had a longitudinal characteristic to it. I could look at what happened to this patient over time across a variety of venues of care. And so today we sit on a precipice. The precipice is you've got a scaffolding of the billing data, right? Because the billing data is it's the best data to use to get the big picture. Okay, here's a patient and they went to the emergency room and they were admitted, and then they went to behavioral health, and then they went to a cardiologist, and you have the mapping of what their clinical experience was, what their encounters were, and then the deeper clinical data that gets into what was their PHQ-9 score and what was the outcome of those visits. That data becomes the flesh, or the finishing of the building on the scaffolding. And that's really the moment that we're at. We're at a moment now where all of that has matured, and without a huge expense, it's relatively easy to get the picture of population health in a cohort. And that, in my opinion, in our very dysfunctional healthcare system, that is the key to improving outcomes, quality, safety, cost. It's that combination of clinical data and administrative data being applied and thoughtfully addressed to get the outcomes we're looking for.
I have a little bit of a disconnect with your optimistic view because I love it on the one hand. On the other hand, I see that underlying challenge in the current healthcare misaligned motivations of different stakeholders. And I'm sure this data is usually going to be taken advantage of by big players, like players who own most of the health system. Like I was talking to one of my guests who mentioned like that United Healthcare owns like 9% of total GDP of healthcare. Like part of GDP in healthcare is like 20%, and 9% of that is by like one organization. So what makes you optimistic that just having data without addressing those underlying mismatches to generate those great outcomes for the population at large, not only for the like affluent segments of the population?
Yeah, I mean, look, I wouldn't say my statements were optimistic about the healthcare delivery system as a whole.
Okay.
I was saying, hey, we're at a really interesting moment where it comes to population health data, your original question. Now, if we want to talk about optimizing the system, you got to get the data right. And the good news is we're at a point where there's a possibility of getting the data right and having the data and insights to know what works, what doesn't work, what's efficient, what's not efficient, who in the population we need to intervene with. It's interesting, the fastest growing company in healthcare is a company called Vita Health. What do? They go into Medicaid programs and help Medicaid programs identify and intervene in the sickest of the sick. And so a for-profit enterprise has a strong economic incentive to find ways to improve outcomes for our most fragile, our most exposed of our population. That to me is a good thing. Is it unhealthy that Optum is so large and is essentially, a vertically and horizontally integrated healthcare enterprise? I don't think Optum's evil or United Healthcare is evil. I think they're just chasing the profit motive, and our healthcare delivery system is a two-pronged delivery system. It's a really nice system for the rich and a really dysfunctional system for the poor, and then there's the middle class caught kind of in the middle of it.
I love how you put it, but back to maybe simplified version of my question.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the trajectory of where the healthcare delivery, not just healthcare, but healthcare delivery is headed?
I'm optimistic, and I'm a cynical guy. Let's start there, and I'll pound the table with everybody else that we need to have more pay for performance. No outcome, no income, as David Nash famously says. And I believe that pay for performance and population health and the economic incentives of population health are the only way in our delivery system that will get better outcomes. We've got to pay for results. Now, am I optimistic about individual average experience in healthcare for the next 5 years? Yeah. We did work, most recently I worked with a company called MedChat, and we automated transactions. The painful part of, I got to schedule an appointment, and I got to call, and I got to wait on the phone, and I got to answer questions, and then I have a hard time finding that appointment. We would automate that and make that go a lot more smoothly, so you didn't have to get on the phone. Or if you got on the phone, the person that was asking those questions could get a lot more into what you needed and making sure that you're going to the right care. In that journey, I recognize that we're all excited about AI right now. We were using AI to do some of that. And what was amazing is we could dramatically transform experience. We could have 50, 70% efficiency gains. We could reduce the number of callbacks. we could consistently prove that as you brought that automation to bear, the user experience was a lot better. Mm-hmm. The productivity was improved, which means you're taking cost out of the system. That also has some implications to labor, right? We're about to see a massive shift of labor, right? Healthcare had sucked a lot of labor in, particularly for administrative tasks. I'd say in the next 5 years, we're probably going to see less of that. There is going to be less of a need for administrative labor in healthcare. And it's a very tedious system that we've created, so it had this huge layer of administrative overhead. I'm optimistic because I believe that the technologies that already exist that are now being deployed, I think they'll change that a lot. I think they'll be quite transformative.
So let's talk about technologies a little bit. And you mentioned AI helping with administrative pieces and kind of automations.
Yep.
What kind of impact do you envision AI will have on actual delivery of care? And should actually AI be used instead of healthcare professionals to be able to offer scale, access, and availability of care to larger chunks of the population?
Yeah. So there's one of the areas that I think is most interesting in this space is the application of AI to triage patients. So, wouldn't it be great if anytime you felt bad or sick or were concerned and you wanted access or you felt that you needed access to care, wouldn't it be great if there was an AI that you could interact with and that AI was as sophisticated as a neurologist or as advanced as the best primary care physician at figuring out the right care for you? Now, is there an AI that can do that? No. Will there be an AI that can do that someday? Probably. It makes sense, right? Because, well, what is that? What is it that makes that neurologist or that cardiologist good? Training and experience. And their core capabilities as a human being. Can AI replicate that? Well, there's pretty strong evidence that eventually it will. But today, I think what's exciting is the idea of that AI supplementing that provider and making that provider better. Think of it as driver assist. And so one area that I think super interesting, there's a researcher up in Boston, Adam Rowan, and some of his peers. They've been doing some great work where they are benchmarking the performance of triage algorithms with humans. And their research is not, fully conclusive yet. They still have a ways to go. But essentially what they're doing is they're creating a framework that says, hey, is this algorithm as good as a clinician in detecting, diagnosing, asking questions, taking history, finding out about the chief complaint, teasing out what it is that patient needs. Now, is that AI going to be able to prod on the belly and see if the abdomen's overly firm? Is it going to be able to smell the patient? Is it able to see the pallor of the patient and be able to just from that know something's going on? Boy, we're a long way off from replacing clinicians in being able to do all those things. But can I make a clinician better at doing those things? Probably. Can I use those things to get the right patient to the right provider at the right urgency? And now I'm allocating access more efficiently? Yeah. And that's going to be a big, big deal.
So we are talking right now about great healthcare, right? Healthcare for the rich.
I think this is as applicable, if not more applicable, to you and I and to those that don't have regular access to care. I'll give you an example. There was a project that Premier ran, or I guess Pink AI ran, in collaboration with a few other stakeholders, where they took a large chunk of data from one of the health information exchanges. And what they were looking at were lung imaging studies that showed nodules. A nodule, I think something like 4 or 5% of people who have a nodule on their lung it will be precancerous in 4 or 5% of the cases, not everybody. Well, these lung nodules are something you want to do about if you find, well, guess what? There was an enormous amount of lung imaging that happened during the COVID pandemic. So there was this massive data set of all of these lung imaging reports that showed nodules. Now, what they did is they took AI and they used it to evaluate whether the appropriate follow-on care occurred for those patients. And they used a health information exchange as the data source. So if what you should have done was gone and be further evaluated, maybe a large bore biopsy or additional imaging. But there's a standard of care once a lung nodule is discovered. Well, what they found, and it was only possible using machine learning to look at this scale of data and be able to detect who had received the appropriate follow-on care and who had not. They were expecting, I think, 10,000 patients that would meet that criteria that were detected but didn't have the right follow-on care. It got into the 50,000, 75,000 range of patients. So these patients would never have even been made aware of a potential cancer, except for the fact that these algorithms were being applied to the data. And it turns out that it was actually fairly cheap to go look at the data in that way. So I think we're at a precipice where doing interesting things with healthcare data to generate better care, better quality downstream, doing that at scale is going to be a lot cheaper in 3 to 5 years than it was for the history of healthcare.
And I wanted to take your example because in your example, there was a machine learning algorithm that did the hard lifting. And I talked to one doctor, Joel Solonikio. He's a TED speaker and he was on Health Tech Crew podcast. And he came up with a challenging idea that actually 95% of people do not have access to any doctor or nurse in the world. And he was with international organizations coming to different places. Yeah. And for them, using scale, automation, even at not perfect level that we want for this world, is the solution actually. So an alternative to having an AI doctor is to have no care at all.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I also think we shouldn't forget the amazing scale of medicines and medical devices and implants. I mean, the level of technology that we have available to us, you and I can go to a pharmacy and we can buy drugs over the counter that were only dreamed of 15 years ago. And so it shouldn't be lost on us, as critical as we are of our healthcare system. The flip side of it is, holy smokes, look what is available to us.
Okay. I wanted to touch base on the kind of next subject, which is business of healthcare.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about what Business of Healthcare series is, and can you share any insights or stories that influenced your thinking about healthcare industry through those conversations that you had as part of this series?
Greatest experience of my life, other than meeting my wife and falling in love.
Wow.
working in with BOH was just an amazing experience. So the idea was a shout out to 2 people that were instrumental in helping me. Blake Margraft, who helped me develop the idea, and Stephen Howard from University of Alabama, Birmingham, who helped really think through the strategic points. But Business of Healthcare was the idea of let's take people who had done really, really transformational things in healthcare. And in particular, transformational things that I could prove elevated both mission and margin. What do I mean by that? Well, it's easy for me to tell you all the things that we could do to improve the mission of healthcare. Let's give everybody primary care doctors. That would be great. Let's give it to the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. Well, financially, it doesn't work that way. We can't all have our own primary care physician. But there are things that we can do in the delivery system that can elevate mission and make financial sense and are sustainable. And so in that journey, it was one interview after the other with these different stakeholders, and just finding these incredible people, incredibly intelligent, incredibly motivated. And it was a wonderful experience. What did I learn from it? What are the epiphanies? The epiphanies are that the scale of work and people out in the world doing things is so enormous we can't even comprehend it. There are so many people doing so many amazing things. It's just impossible for us to comprehend as an individual what goes on in our healthcare ecosystem. The other observation is that most people are right-minded. I've found very few cases where the profit motive or the level of greed was so extreme as to put me off from the mission. Most people were right-minded that I ran into in that journey, and that gives me hope.
Yeah, I think the challenge with right-minded system with a right-minded attitude in a system with wrong kind of setup is that everyone is doing a good thing, but the system as a whole is not delivering the results it's supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of our biggest problems right now is physician burnout. And, really, if you think about somebody who chooses to go to medical school and chooses to take on the responsibility of perfection, right? We expect perfection from our physicians. We expect something that's impossible. And then we put them in a world with electronic health records and silly billing rules and goofy HIPAA compliance requirements. We put so many burdens on them that we make their work dissatisfying, and they leave the industry. The same thing's happening in nursing. We have a flight of nurses leaving the industry because it's, in some cases, very miserable. And these are some of the most right-minded people around. The fact that somebody goes into medicine, into nursing, they're giving a lot. And so I do have a grave concern that our system is undermining the motives and incentives and desires of those people who are ready to come and give. And I think that's a big risk for us right now.
I'm always curious. We started this conversation with like bluntness and being a little bit of a
Yes.
renegade,
Let's get blunt.
changing things. Have you met blunt senior leaders, so senior leaders who were in big organizations, who were willing to stick their head up or out and try unconventional things or come up with non-conventional ideas and actually get some results? Or is it more everyone is well-intentioned as long as it doesn't affect their livelihood and the stability of the system they're part of?
Well, I think you've just defined the differentiating characteristic of the great leaders, right? The great leaders in healthcare, at least the ones that I've encountered, are the people who are savvy enough to know what should be done and wise enough to know when to bring that topic up or not. I think of two physician leaders from St. Louis, Gavin Helton and Jeff Saramita. They are respectively the senior physician executives at a health system called Mercy. Two of the most profoundly good people that I know. And what makes them so successful and got them to being at the pinnacle of their profession is that wisdom, that grace to know when to raise your hand and when to influence the situation in the right direction. I think most senior leaders are pretty good at that. You don't get there if you're not good at that. I think mid-level managers, that's the place where you're really in a trap. You probably are in the mid-levels, the directors and vice presidents within a health system or within a life sciences organization. You're closest to the real world, that you probably have the best sense of what's going right and what's going wrong. But you you have to be extremely conservative and cautious about what to do with that knowledge and information. That's where you spend a lot of time thinking carefully about your own career as you make every move. I worked in a health system, and I wasn't good at that. I wasn't good at all at having that wisdom to know when to shut up and when to raise the hand.
Could you share a war story from that experience?
Oh gosh, probably the best example that I can give is it's such a nuanced thing, but as a salesperson selling healthcare technology into medical groups and health systems, one of the things that I learned to do was, when you're interacting with a physician in a business context, to develop a first name agreement or whatever. And that is being able to use their first name in a conversation. I didn't realize that there's an unwritten rule in a health system. If you work in a health system, don't ever call a physician by their first name in a group setting. You call a physician by doctor this or doctor that.
In a group setting, you mean if it's like more than
in a
one?
meeting or, yeah. It's not an inappropriate sort of unwritten rule. What it really is doing is it's recognizing at the end of the day, there's one person sitting in this room that has to be perfect, and that is accountable for the result. And that's the physician. And that's as true in a business setting as it is in a clinical setting. And so that was an unwritten rule that I didn't learn. And it affected my relationships. And soon I learned and got that figured out. But it was an important insight.
And I appreciate this war story and this specific example and how tangible it is. And that's what I'm looking for in these conversations. Do you have an example, not necessarily from your life, but from those leaders you mentioned who were able to create some meaningful change within their organization by changing the rules, tweaking something, or disrupting the system?
Yeah, boy, there's so many concrete examples of that. I would say a leader that a lot of people in Charlotte know, Katie Caney, is a really great example of that. And Katie, she was a senior leader at Atrium, Carolinas Healthcare prior to that, and she did things like ran the emergency ambulance system, and she ran behavioral health, and she did a lot of things across the delivery system. And what was astounding to me is she could make things happen. And she did it in the classic way. She was trusted. She was really smart, is really smart. She's still around, but well trusted, had invested her time in relationships so people knew she was right-minded. And she was blunt when she needed to be, and she got results. And that combination was transformational. A lot of programs that existed at the time would not have existed, and the innovations that were going on inside the delivery system wouldn't have happened without her pushing them along.
And she was at the top level of the organization, or at the middle?
She was, pretty senior. She wasn't C-suite, but she reported to C-suite, and she had there were a lot of people that were listening to her.
Very cool. I love that example, and I love that you mentioned specific capabilities you need to have in your pocket to be able to change things.
Yeah.
No, this is awesome. I love it. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to ask about trends that you're seeing. You have a lot of experience and exposure to the industry right now and over the years. What are the emerging trends or innovations that you're seeing now that excite you the most?
Yeah. So I'm going to come at that with what are the three most important problems to solve.
Okay, perfect.
I think the biggest crisis we have is the staffing crisis, particularly nurses and physicians. That is a really, really serious issue that will affect all of us. What I see transforming there are two things. One is the effort to get the EHR to be more friendly to get technology to be in the background. The worst thing in today's day-to-day grind of being a physician is you're in the room with the patient. You spent your whole life studying and working hard to have those moments of caring for people and the laying of hands and the giving of yourself and the helping of others. That's what motivates great physicians. To put a PC into that experience and put a billing system into that experience really ruins it for everybody. And I think there's a lot of really great technologies that are moving the ball in fixing that. One that I really like, a company called Health Notes. They've created a technology which can engage the consumer or the patient before the visit, gather all the information that the provider is going to need for the visit, and put it into the record so it's sitting there waiting for the provider in the right place so the provider can pay attention. The other technology in that domain is ambient listening, the ability for the provider and the patient to just interact and to have the AI in the background gathering the information and putting it where it needs to be. I think those are very interesting. So that was the first problem.
And this is like, it solves kind of the experience of providers, but you feel better experience will allow more providers or more people to go into the profession, correct?
Yeah, I think that. Thank you for drawing the connection there. I think if we can improve the work and lived experience of nurses and physicians, I think we dramatically increase the attractiveness of that as the work for our up and coming next generation. The second problem is the opioid crisis. The severity of that crisis and the long-term impact for the next few generations of Americans is going to be enormous. We have a lot of kids without parents because of the opioid crisis. What am I excited about there? I'm excited about a great innovation in the approach to how to intervene. Unfortunately, the best moment, the golden hour of intervention to help somebody who's affected by opioid use disorder is immediately after an overdose. That's when they're most likely to be receptive to breaking the cycle. And so there's a concept called the PORT CP team. This is a post-overdose response team staffed by community paramedics. And the idea is that immediately after an overdose, where we administer the medication to bring respiration back and save the life, that person's in horrible pain. It's the worst flu you've ever had if you're going through opioid withdrawal symptoms. And so those teams can immediately administer medicated assisted treatment and bring together all the resources that are needed to help somebody who's suffered from opioid use disorder to help them break that cycle. Housing, shelter, food, medical care, legal assistance, all the things necessary to take this person who may be ready to break the cycle and swarm them with the resources they need to be successful. The third issue is access to care. Access to care has gotten to be a real problem, and it's a problem for everybody. I've got an appointment that I needed with a gastroenterologist, and it was 90 days from when I called to make the appointment, and that's not unusual. There's an enormous amount of dysfunction in our system that leads to these access issues. Certainly, income is a huge factor. Race is a huge factor. But just the mechanics of how you get an appointment. And I think the technology that's emerging to do a good job at getting the right patient to the right care at the right urgency, I think we're going to have a very different world in 5 years. I think we're going to be much better at allocating our resources and making access better for everybody.
Thank you so much, Matt. I love your optimism. I love people who come with excitement about technological solutions. I'm also a little bit skeptical that this will be enough, but I'm also a believer in human ingenuity in terms of it's never just ambient listening. There are a lot of small innovations that can happen in different pieces that will make healthcare more exciting profession for doctors to join. And those teams that you mentioned, I'm blown away, but I'm also questioning what's the financial model behind the idea and what are other issues underlying the opioid crisis, where from a political standpoint, this war on drugs, it's a great way to win votes. And from drug cartels, there are a lot of plays in that space, and this is a small piece of the puzzle, which is important. But I don't know. I'm rambling.
No, I think what you're getting at. It's an interesting problem, right? We have an opioid crisis because there were pharmaceutical companies and distributors who made an enormous amount of profit off of getting people hooked on opioids. Now, that's been corrected, right? We've sort of shut that door and held those organizations accountable. There's now a massive opioid settlement of billions of dollars, and that settlement is being routed primarily to the community level, so that the communities that are affected are getting some money. It's never enough, but they're getting some money to help fund these interventions. So when you look at these Port CP teams, most of them are funded either through a municipality or a county making a decision to take taxpayer money and put it into these teams for the public good, or it's the routing of grant funding, whether it's from the opioid settlement or other grant sources like the Dogwood Foundation or Foundation for the Carolinas. So we're seeing, you're right though, we have a dysfunction here. It's sort of like defense spending, right? Defense spending is a public good. It doesn't make, you and I could never be convinced to write a check for national defense. We have to have a taxation system. Solving the opioid crisis and reducing the likelihood of new people developing opioid use disorder, it's a public good, right? It helps all of us to reduce that. It's costly. It's public funding, it's messy, it's not enough, but it's happening.
I wanted now to ask you about what are you up to these days? So after leaving MedChat, is there a specific sector or innovation that you're looking at, and what excites you about the next 12 months?
Yeah, look, I've got a lot of really cool companies that I've had a chance to look at as I'm in a job search. So anybody out there that's looking to hire, I'm available. But no, I've had the chance to look at some really, really interesting companies. It's been, it sucks when you have to do it. The thing that I'm valuing the most is the time that I get to reconnect with folks who, when I was heads down working in my job, I didn't have the time to connect with, and now I can take the time and reconnect with a lot of people. I'm super interested in the application of AI in healthcare. There's a lot of really interesting businesses there. I'm also interested in augmented reality and augmented experience, and how those technologies come into healthcare and are transformative. I'm very, very interested in the access problem, in the application of all these technologies to improve access. So those are the areas that I'm investigating the most.
So with this podcast, we're targeting startup leaders, and some of them could benefit from your expertise, perhaps in a fractional or consulting capacity. Mm-hmm. Could you? Is it something, first of all, that you're offering, and could you talk about some specific challenges where you could be reached out for a follow-up conversation?
Yeah, the biggest problem, or I find healthcare founders go through two phases in their life cycle. The first phase of their life cycle is trying to find product market fit. And that's what I'm good at. I'm good at understanding a market and understanding a product and technology, and sort of seeing how the two connect and where the product market fit is off. So I'm good at that piece. The second problem that happens for founders is they get to this point where they have product market fit, and they're doing all the deals because they're the only person in the organization that sort of understands the customer's business problems and why their capabilities solve that business problem. And so I'm the perfect decompression. I'm really good at stepping in and helping that founder hand off all those sales motions and hand them off in a way that we're confident that they won't fall apart, and then building the commercial team around that to continue to scale, building the team of sales and growth marketers and all of that. So that's where I fit.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me, Igor.
That's a wrap on another insightful episode of Health Tech Crew. A huge thanks to Matthew Hanis for his enlightening discussion on healthcare business. Remember, these conversations are made possible by Kepler Team, a custom software development company that specializes in health tech. As your host, I'm a part of Kepler Team, and I'm honored to facilitate these dialogues. If you find value in our podcast, follow or subscribe to Health Tech Crew for more captivating exchanges. On behalf of the entire Kepler team, thank you for joining us today. Keep innovating, and see you in the next episode.